It began so quietly that most people didn't even realize history had just split into before and after. At 9:17 Universal Time Coordinated, a communications satellite above the Atlantic Ocean went offline. No explosion. No debris. Just silence. Within seconds, 2 more satellites blinked out, then 5, then 12. Ground stations attempted to re-establish connection, cycling frequencies, switching to backup systems, rerouting signals. Nothing responded. At first, it was dismissed as a cascading technical failure. Solar interference, maybe. A rare but not impossible glitch in orbital systems. Engineers scrambled, analysts ran diagnostics, and for a brief moment, the world continued as usual. Then the power grids began to flicker. Across Europe, entire cities experienced simultaneous outages. In North America, air traffic control systems glitched, forcing emergency landings. Financial markets froze mid-transaction. In Asia, communication networks collapsed into static. Within minutes, panic started to ripple, but still, no one knew why. And then, the sky changed. Over London, witnesses would later describe it as glass cracking across the heavens. A thin, glowing line appeared in the clouds, stretching impossibly wide, shimmering with colors no one could name. It pulsed once, twice, and then tore open. Not exploded. Not burned. Opened. From that wound in the sky, something massive began to descend. At first, it looked like a shadow, a distortion. The human brain struggled to process its scale. But as it lowered, blotting out sunlight, its true form became clear. A ship. A structure so enormous it dwarfed the city beneath it. Its surface flowed like liquid metal, constantly shifting, reflecting the world below in warped, unsettling ways. No engines were visible. No sound accompanied its arrival, only a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate inside people's chests. Phones came out. Cameras pointed upward. Social media flooded with images and videos as millions tried to capture the impossible. Within minutes, it wasn't just London. New York, Beijing, Dubai, Sao Paulo, Karachi. Every major city on Earth reported the same phenomenon. The sky tearing open and something coming through. Global news networks tried to go live, but signals were unstable. Some broadcasts cut out mid-sentence. Others showed only static. Emergency alerts triggered across multiple countries, urging citizens to remain calm and stay indoors. But calm was already slipping away. Because deep down, everyone understood the same terrifying truth. This wasn't human. Military forces scrambled worldwide. Fighter jets were deployed, their pilots receiving fragmented orders through failing communication systems. Radar struggled to lock onto the objects. They didn't behave like anything it had ever tracked before. Still, humanity reacted the only way it knew how. It prepared to defend itself. The first jets reached visual range over the Atlantic. Pilots reported contact, then hesitation. The sheer size of the object made engagement feel meaningless. It wasn't a target. It was a presence. Command came through anyway. Approach. Identify. Do not fire unless fired upon. The jets closed in. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the ships moved. Not quickly. Not aggressively. Just deliberately. A section of its surface unfolded, like petals opening in reverse. Light gathered at its core, intense, blinding, humming with energy that made instruments spike wildly. The pilots barely had time to react. A single pulse of light shot outward. It didn't look like a weapon. There was no explosion, no fire, no visible impact. But every jet in the formation shut down instantly. Engines died. Controls failed. Systems went dark. One by one, they fell from the sky. No survivors. The message was clear. And it hadn't even been spoken yet. Across the globe, similar encounters played out. Naval fleets lost power. Missile systems failed to initialize. Defense networks, some of the most advanced ever created, collapsed like fragile toys. Humanity's greatest strength, its technology, had been neutralized in minutes. Then, finally, the message came. Every screen, every device still capable of receiving a signal flickered to life. Phones buzzed. Televisions turned on by themselves. Even old analog systems crackled with sudden clarity. A symbol appeared first, complex, shifting, impossible to fully comprehend. It seemed to rearrange itself as you looked at it, as if your mind couldn't hold its true form. Then came the voice. It wasn't heard through speakers. It was heard inside. Calm, cold, precise. Inhabitants of Earth. The words echoed across every mind, every language simultaneously understood. Your civilization has been evaluated. People froze where they stood. In homes, in streets, in bunkers, in hospitals. Billions of humans, all hearing the same voice, feeling the same unnatural presence pressing against their thoughts. You are inefficient, divided, resource-rich. A pause. Not for effect, but for calculation. Surrender your planet. Resistance is inefficient. That was it. No threats. No negotiations. No demands beyond absolute submission. Just a statement. A conclusion they had already reached. For a few seconds, the world stood still. Then chaos erupted. Some people ran. Others prayed. Governments attempted to respond, issuing statements that barely made it through unstable networks. Military leaders argued, strategized, demanded options that didn't exist. But beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, something else began to stir. Something quieter. Something deeper. Because humans had faced impossible situations before. Not like this, not on this scale, but the instinct was the same. They adapted. In underground bunkers, emergency protocols activated. Backup systems, old, analog, forgotten, were brought online. Engineers who had spent their careers working on obsolete technology suddenly became the most valuable people on Earth. Ham radios crackled to life. Paper maps replaced digital navigation. Mechanical systems, immune to whatever had disabled modern electronics, were pulled out of storage and put back into use. Humanity was regressing, and surviving because of it. Up above, the alien ships remained motionless, hovering like gods observing their domain. They made no further moves. No additional attacks. They didn't need to. From their perspective, the outcome was already decided. Earth was just another world. Another resource. Another entry in a long list of conquered civilizations. They had no concept of what they were dealing with. Because as fear spread across the planet, so did something else. Defiance. Quiet at first. Barely noticeable. A refusal in the minds of individuals who looked up at those massive ships and thought, not we can't win, but we won't kneel. And that was the moment everything changed. The sky hadn't just broken that day. So had the illusion that humanity was alone and fragile. Because the invaders had come expecting submission. What they found instead was a species that didn't know how to surrender. For 12 long minutes after the message, nothing happened. No further attacks. No movement from the colossal ships hanging over Earth cities. No additional communication. Just silence, heavy, suffocating, unnatural. It was the kind of silence that made people hope and fear at the same time. Maybe this was it. Maybe surrender meant survival. Maybe if humanity complied quickly enough, there would be no need for destruction. That fragile hope didn't last. At exactly 9:41 Universal Time Coordinated, the ships moved. Not all at once, but in perfect coordination, as if controlled by a single, unified intelligence. Across every continent, sections of their immense hulls began to shift and open, revealing vast internal structures that glowed with an eerie, contained energy. This time, there was no hesitation, no warning. The first strike began. From orbit, pillars of light descended. They weren't like missiles. There was no arc, no visible propulsion. Just instantaneous beams of concentrated energy, striking their targets with surgical precision. Washington, D.C., gone in a flash of blinding white. Moscow, erased before alarms could finish sounding. Beijing's military command center vanished mid-transmission. Airbases, naval headquarters, missile silos, every major military installation on the planet was hit within seconds of each other. It wasn't random. It was systematic. The aliens weren't attacking humanity. They were dismantling its ability to fight back. Across the globe, people watched in horror as symbols of national power disappeared like they had never existed. Entire complexes reduced to molten craters, their surroundings scorched and flattened by the sheer intensity of the strikes. And then came the second wave. Anything that attempted to respond was immediately targeted. Fighter jets that had managed to get airborne were struck mid-flight, their silhouettes vanishing in flashes of light. Warships lost power and were destroyed where they floated, unable to even send distress signals. Missile launches failed before ignition, systems shutting down under invisible interference. It was as if the enemy could see everything, predict everything, counter everything. Within 5 minutes, the organized military resistance of Earth had effectively ceased to exist. Command chains collapsed. Generals couldn't reach their units. Governments lost contact with entire branches of their armed forces. Satellites, what few remained, showed only chaos and destruction. It should have been the end. By every logical measure, humanity had already lost. But logic had never been humanity's only strength. Because while the aliens targeted systems, structures, and strategies, they overlooked something fundamental. Humans are not a centralized species. There was no single command to destroy. No unified network that, once disabled, would bring everything crashing down. Humanity wasn't efficient. It was messy, fragmented, unpredictable, and that chaos became its greatest advantage. In a small town in Poland, a retired radio operator dusted off equipment he hadn't used in decades. With modern communications down, he began broadcasting on old frequencies, simple, analog signals that the alien interference didn't seem to affect. In rural India, a group of engineers repurposed farming machinery into makeshift generators, restoring power to local communities cut off from the grid. In the United States, a group of civilian pilots, cut off from official command, organized themselves through handwritten notes and visual signals, coordinating flights without digital systems. Across Africa, South America, Asia, Europe, everywhere, people began improvising, adapting, fighting in the only way they still could. Not as nations, but as individuals, as communities, as humans. The aliens didn't notice at first. Why would they? From orbit, the planet looked defeated. Major cities were silent or burning. Military infrastructure was gone. Communications were fragmented and weak. By their calculations, resistance had dropped to near zero. But on the ground, something very different was happening. Survivors began to regroup. Emergency shelters filled with people who refused to give up. Doctors operated without advanced equipment, relying on skill and instinct. Engineers built solutions out of scraps. Hackers, cut off from the global internet, began working locally, trying to understand the alien signals that had crippled their world. And slowly, connections began to form again. Not global, not perfect, but enough. In underground bunkers, fragments of data were analyzed. Patterns in the alien attacks emerged. Timing, target selection, energy signatures. They were precise, but not flawless. In one instance, a strike meant for a naval base hit slightly off target, leaving part of the surrounding infrastructure intact. In another, a drone patrol repeated the same route twice within a short time frame. Small things, almost insignificant, but to the human mind, trained to find patterns, to exploit weaknesses, they were everything. Meanwhile, fear began to change. It didn't disappear, but it transformed. At first, people had been paralyzed by it, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what they were facing. But as the hours passed, as the initial shock faded, something else took its place. Anger. Not loud, not chaotic, focused, controlled. The kind of anger that drives action. Because the aliens had made a critical mistake. They had assumed that destroying humanity's ability to fight would end the conflict. They didn't understand that for humans, fighting isn't just about weapons or command structures. It's about will. And that was something they hadn't even begun to break. By the end of the first hour, scattered resistance had already begun. A group of soldiers in South America, cut off from command, used old anti-aircraft guns, manually operated, to target low-flying alien drones. They didn't expect to succeed. But one of the drones went down. It wasn't destroyed completely, but it fell. And that changed everything. Because for the first time since the invasion began, the enemy had been hit. Word spread quickly, carried through fragmented channels and human networks that didn't rely on technology alone. Stories of small victories began to circulate. A disabled drone here. A disrupted signal there. Proof that the invaders weren't invincible. And once that idea took hold, it spread faster than any broadcast ever could. Up above, the alien ships continued their silent watch, confident in their dominance. Their scans showed minimal organized resistance. Their projections indicated total compliance within hours, days at most. They didn't adjust their strategy. They didn't escalate. They simply waited. Because in every previous conquest, this had been enough. Overwhelming force. Precise dismantling. Inevitable submission. But Earth wasn't like the other worlds they had conquered. Because here, even when everything was taken away, humans kept fighting. Not because they believed they would win, but because they refused to lose. And that difference was something the Galactic Empire had never encountered before. By the end of the first day, Earth was no longer a connected world. It was a patchwork. Isolated cities. Silent regions. Pockets of survivors cut off from one another, each struggling to understand what had just happened and what came next. The global systems that once defined human civilization were gone, replaced by fragments held together by improvisation and sheer determination. And yet, within that chaos, something remarkable was beginning to form. Understanding. Because while the aliens had demonstrated overwhelming, they had also revealed something else, something subtle, but critical. They weren't adapting. At first, no one noticed. The strikes continued, but they followed the same patterns. Precision attacks on any location that showed signs of coordinated activity. Drones patrolling predictable routes. Energy pulses targeting clusters of electronic signals. Efficient. Relentless. But repetitive. And repetition is something humans are very, very good at breaking. The first observations. It started small. In an underground facility somewhere in Eastern Europe, a group of engineers and data analysts gathered around a flickering screen powered by a jury-rigged generator. They didn't have access to satellites anymore, but they had recordings, fragments captured before the networks went down. Visual data. Signal logs. Partial telemetry. At first glance, it was noise. But to trained eyes, it was a pattern waiting to be uncovered. One analyst noticed that the alien drones didn't scan continuously. Instead, they pulsed in intervals, short bursts of high-intensity detection followed by brief moments of inactivity. Milliseconds. Barely noticeable. But real. Another engineer observed that the energy beams used in orbital strikes had a slight delay between target lock and discharge. Not enough for conventional systems to react, but enough for something faster. Something preemptive. Meanwhile, in a completely different part of the world, a group of university students, cut off from their campus, working from a basement filled with outdated computers, were studying the same problem from another angle. Signal interference. The alien transmissions that had shut down Earth's technology weren't random. They were structured, layered, and, most importantly, consistent. One student, barely 20 years old, made a breakthrough. "They're not jamming everything," she said, staring at the crude waveform on her screen. "They are prioritizing." The realization hit like a shockwave. The aliens weren't blocking all signals equally. They were targeting specific frequencies. Modern ones. Digital ones. Efficient ones. Which meant older, analog systems, messy, imprecise, outdated, were slipping through the cracks. The advantage of imperfection. For decades, Humanity had been moving toward perfection in communication. Faster speeds, cleaner signals, seamless global networks. Now, that perfection had become a weakness. Because the alien systems were designed to counter advanced civilizations that relied on optimized, predictable technologies. They weren't prepared for something less refined. Across the globe, a quiet shift began. People started digging into the past. Old radios, mechanical systems, pre-digital infrastructure, technologies that had been abandoned in favor of sleeker, smarter alternatives were suddenly back in use. And they worked. Not perfectly, not reliably, but enough. More importantly, they were invisible, or at least less visible, to the alien detection systems. Humanity had found its first real advantage. Not strength, not firepower, but unpredictability, breaking the code. While engineers focused on survival, another group was taking the fight in a different direction. Hackers. Cut off from the internet, they operated in isolated clusters, sharing information through physical drives, handwritten notes, and whatever limited connections they could establish. Their target wasn't the ships themselves. It was the signal. The same signal that had crippled Earth's technology. Could it be turned against its creators? At first, progress was slow. The alien transmissions were unlike anything human systems had encountered. Multilayered, constantly shifting, operating on principles that didn't fully align with known physics. But they weren't incomprehensible. Just different. And humans had always excelled at understanding the unfamiliar. After nearly 18 hours of non-stop work, a team in South Korea achieved something extraordinary. They didn't decode the signal, but they disrupted it. For less than a second, in a localized area, the alien interference weakened. And in that moment, brief, fragile, almost insignificant, something happened. A powered-down system flickered back to life. A radar installation, dead for nearly a day, suddenly registered movement. Then it went dark again. But it didn't matter. Because that single moment proved something humanity desperately needed to know. The alien control wasn't absolute. It could be interfered with. Maybe even broken. Understanding the enemy. By the second day, fragments of information began to converge. From different continents, different groups, different approaches, all pointing to the same conclusion. The aliens were powerful, but they weren't flexible. Their systems were designed for efficiency, not adaptability. They relied on centralized control, predictable algorithms, and overwhelming to dominate their targets. It had worked for them before, countless times. But Earth wasn't behaving like their previous conquests. Instead of collapsing completely, it was fragmenting, and then reorganizing in ways they hadn't anticipated. Small, independent units. Uncoordinated, but effective. Messy, but resilient. And most importantly, constantly learning. Turning knowledge into a weapon. Understanding the enemy was one thing. Using that knowledge was another. But humans didn't wait. They never had. In a hidden lab somewhere in North America, scientists worked on adapting EMP devices, crude by pre-invasion standards, but now potentially devastating. If the alien systems relied on precise ICS and centralized control, then even a temporary disruption could create openings. Meanwhile, in Europe, engineers modified old missile systems to operate without digital guidance. Manual targeting. Analog controls. Less accurate, but immune to interference. In Asia, programmers developed algorithms designed not to break the alien code, but to confuse it. Feeding false patterns. Creating noise where there should be clarity. Everywhere, the same idea took hold. If you can't overpower your enemy, outthink them. The shift. Up above, the alien ships remained as they always had. Silent, watchful, unmoving. From their perspective, the situation was stable. Resistance levels were low. No large-scale coordination detected. No significant to their operations. Their models showed a steady progression toward total. They didn't see the change. Not yet. Because it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Subtle. a species learning in real time, adapting faster than it had any right to, preparing for something the aliens didn't believe was possible. A counterattack. The first real victory. It happened in the early hours of the second night. A small, coordinated effort, if it could even be called that. 3 separate groups, thousands of miles apart, acting on shared understanding rather than direct communication. One disrupted a signal. Another tracked a drone. The third fired. For a fraction of a second, the alien drone lost its connection to the central system. Its movements faltered. It's weakened. And in that moment, a human-made projectile struck its target. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but effectively. The drone didn't just fall this time. It exploded. Fragments of alien technology rained down onto the below. Proof. Undeniable, physical proof. The enemy could be hurt. A dangerous realization. News of the destroyed drone spread quickly, through whispers, through signals, through the fragile network humanity had rebuilt from nothing. And with that news came a shift. Hope. Not blind optimism. Not the belief that victory was certain, but the understanding that it was possible. And that made humanity dangerous. Because once humans believe something can be done, they don't stop until it is. Up above, for the first time since the invasion began, the alien systems registered an anomaly. A deviation from expected outcomes. Small, insignificant, but growing. They began to adjust their calculations, to account for variables they hadn't considered. But by then, it was already too late, because humanity wasn't just surviving anymore. It was learning. And in war, the side that learns faster wins. By the third day, Earth was no longer just surviving. It was preparing. The shift was subtle at first, almost invisible beneath the chaos. Small victories had begun to stack. A drone destroyed here. A signal disrupted there. Nothing that could threaten an empire, but enough to change the equation. Because war isn't won in a single moment. It's won when one side realizes the other won't break. And humanity had made that clear. The rise of a new kind of warfare. There was no central command. No global leader coordinating the response. No unified strategy. And yet, across continents, the same idea was emerging. Hit them where they don't expect. The aliens had built their invasion on control. Tight, precise, overwhelming control. Every movement calculated. Every strike optimized. Humans responded with the exact opposite. Chaos. Unpredictability. In South America, small teams moved through dense jungles, using the terrain to mask their movements. Alien drones, designed for open-field surveillance, struggled to track targets beneath thick canopies. When they dipped lower to compensate, they were met with ambushes, explosives triggered manually, weapons fired from concealed positions. In Eastern Europe, urban ruins became hunting grounds. Fighters used narrow streets, underground tunnels, and collapsed infrastructure to stay out of sight. Drones flying overhead couldn't distinguish between debris and danger. And when they descended, they didn't always come back up. In the Middle East, desert played tricks on alien sensors. Heat signatures fluctuated wildly, confusing detection systems. Human fighters learned to manipulate those patterns, creating false targets while striking from unexpected angles. Every environment became a weapon. Every weakness exploited, reclaiming the skies. For 2 days, the sky had belonged to the invaders. That began to change. Not with a grand offensive, but with risk. Fighter pilots, flying aircraft that should have been obsolete, took to the air again. Without advanced targeting systems, they relied on sight, instinct, and coordination through analog signals. It was dangerous, almost suicidal, but it worked. Because the aliens hadn't expected it. Their defenses were tuned to detect and counter modern threats, guided missiles, digital tracking, synchronized attacks. They weren't prepared for pilots who flew low, fast, and unpredictable, who made decisions in the moment instead of following programmed patterns. The first successful aerial strike came from a squadron that never should have existed. Old jets. Limited fuel. Minimal support. They approached an alien vessel at dangerously low altitude, using terrain to stay hidden until the last possible moment. Then they climbed. Fast. Aggressive. Unpredictable. The alien ship responded, but just a fraction too late. A volley of unguided munitions struck its surface. At first, nothing happened. Then, a reaction. Not an explosion, but a ripple. A visible distortion across the ship's fluid-like exterior. Damage. Small, but real. The pilots didn't survive the counterattack. But they didn't need to, because they had proven something invaluable. The ships could be hurt. Weapons of desperation. As the realization spread, humanity escalated. Everything became a weapon. Factories, those that still functioned, shifted production overnight. Civilian industries turned into war machines, producing whatever could be used to fight back. Crude EMP devices were deployed in key, creating temporary blind zones where alien systems struggled to operate. Within those zones, humans moved freely, setting traps, launching attacks, disappearing before retaliation could arrive. Railgun prototypes, once considered experimental, were brought online despite incomplete testing. Their raw kinetic power proved effective against alien materials, especially when combined with precise timing. Even older weapons found new purpose. Artillery, manually operated and carefully concealed, began targeting predictable drone paths. Without digital signatures to track, these weapons slipped past alien defenses. It wasn't clean. It wasn't efficient. But it was working. The turning point. Then came the moment that changed everything. Not a battle. Not a victory. A plan. It started with data. From every successful attack, every disrupted signal, every fragment of alien technology recovered, a clearer picture was forming. The ships weren't independent. They were connected. A network. Centralized. Which meant one thing. If that network could be broken, even for a moment, their entire system would falter. The idea spread quickly. Through coded messages. Through analog broadcasts. Through human networks that no longer relied on satellites or the internet. It wasn't a coordinated order. It was a shared understanding. And across the globe, preparations began. The global assault. It happened on the fourth day. No countdown. No official announcement. Just a moment, chosen almost instinctively, when enough pieces were in place. It started with the signal. Hackers and engineers, working in isolation but guided by the same principles, launched simultaneous interference attempts. Crude, unstable, but synchronized enough to matter. For a fraction of a second, the alien network flickered. That was the opening. And humanity took it. From hidden silos, submarines deep beneath the oceans, mobile launchers scattered across continents, missiles were fired. Not guided by advanced systems, but aimed with everything humanity had learned. At the same time, aircraft surged upward. Ground forces launched coordinated strikes. EMP zones expanded, creating pockets of disruption across the planet. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean. But it was overwhelming. For the first time since the invasion began, the aliens were on the defensive. Fire in the sky. The effect was immediate. Alien ships, once untouchable, began to falter. Some lost, entirely, drifting slightly out of position. Others failed to activate their defenses in time. And then, they started to fall. The first ship to go down was over the Pacific Ocean. A massive structure, once silent and imposing, suddenly erupted with cascading failures. Light flickered across its surface. Sections of its hull destabilized. Then gravity took hold. It fell slowly at first, almost gracefully. Then faster, burning as it entered the atmosphere. The impact sent shockwaves across the ocean, visible from miles away. Around the world, similar scenes played out. Ships damaged. Drones disabled. Fragments of an unstoppable force, breaking apart. The Empire realizes. Up until that moment, the invasion had been routine. Predictable. Controlled. Now, it wasn't. For the first time, The alien command faced something they hadn't encountered in countless conquests. A species that could adapt faster than their models could predict. Their response was immediate. Escalation. More ships repositioned. Attack patterns intensified. New strategies deployed. But it was too late to regain the advantage they had lost. Because the illusion had been shattered. They were no longer seen as invincible. And once that happens in war, everything changes. Humanity unleashed. On the ground, the reaction was immediate. Where there had once been, there was now determination. Where there had been hesitation, there was now action. Humans didn't wait for orders. They didn't need them. Every success fueled the next. Every victory, no matter how small, pushed them forward. Because now they knew. The enemy could bleed. The enemy could fall. And most importantly, the enemy could lose. A war unlike any other. This wasn't a conventional war. There were no front lines. No clear boundaries. Just a planet fighting back in every way it could. Messy. Uncoordinated. Relentless. Exactly the kind of war the aliens had never trained for. And as the fires of burning ships lit up the night sky, one truth became impossible to ignore. The Galactic Empire hadn't just invaded a planet. It had awakened a species. A species that didn't just fight to survive, but to win. By the fifth day, the war no longer looked the way the invaders had planned. From orbit, Earth was still scarred, cities damaged, infrastructure shattered, large in chaos. By every conventional metric, it should have been a conquered world. But it wasn't. Because beneath that destruction, something far more dangerous had taken shape. Adaptation. A flawed assumption. The Galactic Empire had conquered dozens, maybe hundreds, of worlds before Earth. Their strategy was simple, refined over countless victories. Overwhelming force. Rapid dismantling of structures. Psychological dominance. Then, submission. It had always worked. Because most civilizations, when faced with an enemy they couldn't comprehend, an enemy that could erase entire cities in seconds, chose survival over resistance. They surrendered. They complied. They survived. Under control. The Empire expected the same from Earth. They saw humanity's divisions, nations, languages, conflicts, and assumed weakness. A fragmented species couldn't mount a unified defense. They saw reliance on technology and assumed vulnerability. Disable the systems, and the species would collapse. They saw fear in the initial moments and assumed inevitability. What they didn't understand was what humans become after the fear. Fear was never the end. In the early hours of the invasion, fear had been everywhere. Panic in the streets. Desperation in voices. Confusion in every to respond. But fear, for humans, isn't an endpoint. It's a phase. And once it passes, it changes. By the fifth day, that fear had transformed into something else entirely. Resolve. Cold. Focused. Unyielding. People no longer looked at the alien ships with helplessness. They looked at them like targets. A species without a single breaking point. The Empire's greatest strength had always been precision. Strike the right places, and everything else falls apart. Destroy leadership. Collapse infrastructure. Sever communication. But on Earth, there was no single point of failure. Destroy a government, and another structure forms. Cut off communication, and humans find another way. Eliminate organized military, and civilians take up the fight. It wasn't efficient. It wasn't predictable. But it was impossible to fully suppress. Because humanity didn't rely on a single system to survive. It relied on itself. The rise of human ingenuity. Every hour, humans became more dangerous. Not stronger. Not better equipped. But smarter. Engineers began modifying alien drone fragments into primitive but effective countermeasures. Devices that could mimic alien signals just enough to confuse their systems. Fighters used captured materials to reinforce their defenses, creating hybrid technology that combined human creativity with alien durability. In the Americas, scientists pushed experimental weapons beyond their limits, accepting risks they never would have considered before. Failure was no longer a deterrent. It was part of the process, because time mattered more than perfection, and humans were learning faster than the Empire could adapt. War without rules. The Empire fought with discipline, structure, control. Humans didn't. There were no fixed strategies, no predictable patterns. One day, a group might use EMP devices to disable drones. The next, they might lure those same drones into terrain where they could be destroyed manually. Tactics changed constantly, improvised, evolved. It wasn't just difficult to counter. It was impossible to model. Alien systems, designed to anticipate and neutralize threats, began to struggle. Their predictions, once nearly perfect, started to fail. Not dramatically, but enough. And in war, enough is all it takes. The psychological shift. For the first time in their history of conquest, the Empire encountered something unfamiliar. An enemy that didn't behave logically. From their perspective, continued resistance was inefficient. The probability of human victory remained low. The cost of defiance was catastrophic. And yet, humans kept fighting. Not just soldiers. Everyone. Civilians sabotaged alien operations. Engineers risked their lives to test unstable technology. Pilots flew missions with no guarantee of survival. Even when defeat seemed certain in specific, resistance didn't stop. It intensified. This wasn't just war. It was defiance at a species level. And the Empire didn't know how to counter that. Escalation and its limits. Recognizing the shift, the alien command made a decision. Escalate. More ships were deployed into lower orbit. Attack patterns became more aggressive. New weapons, more destructive, less precise, were introduced. Entire regions were targeted to suppress resistance. For a moment, it seemed like the tide might turn back in their favor. But escalation came with a cost. The more force they used, the more data humans gathered. The more patterns they revealed. The more opportunities they created. Every new weapon was studied. Every new tactic analyzed. And within hours, countered. Not perfectly, not completely, but effectively enough to matter. The cost of underestimation. The Empire's greatest mistake wasn't their strategy. It was their assumption. They believed humanity was like every other species they had encountered. Predictable, breakable, conquerable. They didn't realize that humans don't just respond to. They evolve because of it. Pressure doesn't collapse them. It refines them. And by the fifth day, that refinement had reached a critical point. Humanity was no longer reacting. It was anticipating. A dangerous realization. Up above, within the command structures of the invading fleet, something began to change. The data no longer aligned with expectations. Resistance wasn't decreasing. It was growing. Efficiency projections were dropping. Casualty estimates, once negligible, were rising. For the first time, a new variable was introduced into their calculations. Uncertainty. It was small, but it wasn't supposed to exist at all. And that made it dangerous. Because uncertainty leads to hesitation. And hesitation is fatal in war. Humans stop surviving. On the ground, the shift was undeniable. Humans were no longer just trying to survive the invasion. They were trying to win. Plans became more ambitious. Attacks more coordinated. Risks more calculated. The idea of victory, once impossible, was now a goal. A distant one. A difficult one. But real. And that changed everything. The moment the war turned, there wasn't a single battle that defined the turning point. No grand victory that marked the shift. It was quieter than that. A realization, shared across millions of minds, that the Empire could be beaten, that they weren't gods, that they had weaknesses, and that those weaknesses could be exploited. Once that idea took hold, the outcome of the war was no longer certain. The Empire's fatal error. In all their history, the Galactic Empire had never lost a world like this. Because they had never faced a species like this. A species that doesn't surrender when defeat is likely. A species that doesn't stop when the odds are impossible. A species that learns, adapts, and fights harder the more pressure it faces. They had come to Earth expecting submission. Instead, they had created something far worse. An enemy that refused to lose. And by the time they realized their mistake, humanity was already becoming something they could no longer control. Something they could no longer predict. Something they might not be able to defeat. Because the greatest threat to an empire isn't a stronger enemy. It's an enemy that refuses to break. And Earth wasn't breaking. By the 6th day, the war had entered its final phase. Not because the fighting had slowed, but because the outcome, once unthinkable, was beginning to take shape. The Galactic Empire still held the advantage in raw power. Their ships still loomed over Earth. Their weapons still capable of devastating entire regions in seconds. But power alone was no longer enough. Because something had shifted. Something fundamental. The invaders were no longer in control. A fractured empire. From orbit, the alien fleet had once operated as a perfect system. Every ship connected. Every action synchronized. Every response calculated with flawless precision. Now, that system was breaking apart. Human interference, crude, inconsistent, but relentless, had begun to disrupt their network in ways the Empire couldn't fully compensate for. Signals flickered. Commands delayed. Coordination faltered. Ships that once moved as one, now hesitated. And in war, hesitation kills. The final strategy. Humanity didn't have a central command. But it had something just as powerful. A shared goal. End this. Across the planet, the same idea emerged, not as an order, but as a conclusion. The alien network was the key. Disrupt it long enough, and everything else would fall. The plan wasn't perfect. It couldn't be. It relied on timing across a broken world, coordination without direct communication, and technology that barely functioned. But it was enough. Because it didn't need to be flawless. It just needed to work once. Everything at once. The final assault began without warning. No countdown. No signal. Just a moment, chosen by instinct, by readiness, by the quiet understanding that this was it. Around the globe, hidden systems came online. EMP devices, built from salvaged components, activated in key locations, creating a disruption that rippled outward. Alien sensors flickered, their perception of the battlefield fragmenting. At the same time, hackers launched their most aggressive attack yet. Not to understand the alien signal. Not to control it. But to overwhelm it. Noise. Chaos. Interference layered upon interference. For a fraction of a second, the network broke. The window. It was brief. So brief that, under normal circumstances, it wouldn't have mattered. But humanity had been waiting for it. Across oceans, submarines launched missiles. From hidden bunkers, ground forces fired everything they had left. Aircraft, some barely operational, took to the skies in one final push. Railguns discharged. Artillery roared. Improvised weapons, built in desperation, were unleashed without hesitation. It wasn't a coordinated strike in the traditional sense. It was something else. A global reaction. Every human, every group, every unit acting at once. And for the first time since the invasion began, the aliens couldn't respond in time. The fall of giants. The first ship to fall during the final assault wasn't the largest, but it was the most visible. Hovering above a major city, its structure had been a constant reminder of the Empire's dominance. Now, it faltered. Its surface, once smooth and shifting, began to fracture. Light flickered erratically across its hull. Sections of it lost cohesion, breaking apart like liquid turning solid and then shattering. Then gravity took hold. Slowly at first. Then faster. People watched from below as the impossible happened. The ship fell, burning as it tore through the atmosphere, leaving a trail of fire across the sky. When it hit the ground, the impact shook the earth. And something changed in that moment. Not just on the battlefield, but in the minds of every human who saw it. The enemy was falling. Collapse. Across the globe, the same scene repeated. Ships destabilizing, drones dropping from the sky, systems failing in cascading waves. Without their network, the alien forces were no longer a unified threat. They were isolated, vulnerable. For the first time, humanity had the advantage. And it didn't hesitate. Attacks intensified. Every remaining weapon was used. Every opportunity exploited. The Empire tried to recover, tried to re-establish control. But it was too late. Because the moment they lost coordination, they lost the war, retreat, or destruction. Some alien ships attempted to flee, their forms turning away from Earth, engines, or whatever powered them, activating in a desperate to escape. A few succeeded, but many didn't. Human attacks continued relentlessly, targeting retreating vessels with everything they had left. Ships that had once arrived as symbols of inevitable victory now burned as they tried to leave. And for those that escaped, they carried something far more dangerous than defeat. They carried a message. The message. It wasn't transmitted through signals. It wasn't encoded in data. It was written in destruction. In the wreckage of ships scattered across Earth's surface. In the who had refused to surrender. In the undeniable fact that a species considered primitive had fought back and won. The message was simple. Earth is not a target. It is a warning. Aftermath. When the last alien signal faded, the silence that followed was different from the one that had come before the invasion. This silence wasn't fear. It was disbelief. The sky, once filled with impossible structures, was empty again. Smoke rose from cities. Fires burned where ships had fallen. The scars of the battle were everywhere. The cost had been immense. Millions lost. Entire regions devastated. Nothing would ever be the same. But humanity was still there. Still standing. A new reality. In the days that followed, the world began to rebuild. Not as it had been before, but as something new. The invasion had changed everything. Technology, society, perspective. Humanity was no longer just a species confined to a single planet, unaware of what lay beyond. It had faced the galaxy, and survived. More than that, it had proven something no one had ever imagined. It could win. Beyond the stars. Far from Earth, in the depths of space, the remnants of the galactic empire regrouped. Damaged. Reduced. Uncertain. For the first time in their history, they had encountered defeat. Not by a more advanced civilization. Not by a larger empire. But by a species they had underestimated. A species that had turned chaos into strategy. Weakness into strength. Fear into defiance. And as reports spread, quietly, carefully, across other civilizations, a new idea began to take hold. If the empire could fall, what else was possible? The shortest war. In the records of the Galactic Empire, the invasion of Earth would be remembered as the shortest war they had ever fought. Not because it ended quickly, but because the moment they attacked, they had already lost. They just didn't know it yet. And on Earth, as humanity looked up at a sky that was finally its own again, one truth remained. The galaxy had come to conquer. Instead, it had awakened something far more dangerous. A species that didn't just survive the impossible, but made the impossible regret it.